Somewhere in the deserts of Arabia, more than 1,500 years ago, a camel wandered into a field where it was not allowed to be. A man saw it, raised his bow, and shot it dead. That is how it began. By the time it ended, 40 years later, two entire tribes had nearly destroyed each other. Thousands of men were dead. A generation had grown up knowing nothing but the feud. Famous warriors, poets, and chiefs had been cut down, one after another, in a chain of killing that stretched across 4 decades. And all of it, every raid, every ambush, every grave, could be traced back to a single animal, dead in a field. The Arabs would remember it as one of the most destructive wars in their history, and they gave it a name that became a byword for catastrophe: the War of Basus. For centuries afterward, to say that something was more ill-omened than the Basus was to say it was cursed from the very start. But here is the thing about that camel. The war was never really about the camel. The camel was only an excuse. And the story of how a single excuse could bury a generation is one of the oldest and most important warnings human beings have ever told. This is the story of the war that began with one animal and ended with nothing but graves. To understand the war, you first have to understand the world it happened in. The Arabia of the age the Arabs later called the Jahiliyya, the time before Islam. This was a world without a state. There were no kings ruling over most of the peninsula, no police, no courts, no written law that everyone obeyed. There was only the tribe. Your tribe was your government, your army, your identity, and your only shield in a harsh desert. Outside its bonds, a person was almost nothing. And the glue that held this world together was honor. In a place with no law, honor did the work that law does elsewhere. An insult could not simply be swallowed, because a tribe that let itself be shamed would be seen as weak, and weakness invited destruction. Above all, there was the sacred duty of vengeance. If one of your people was wronged or killed, the honor of the whole tribe demanded that the wrong be answered. Blood for blood. At the center of our story stand two tribes, Bakr and Taghlib, and they were not strangers to each other. By their own reckoning, they were cousins, descended from a single ancestor, a man named Wa'il. They were, in the most literal sense, family, which means the war that was coming would not be a war between strangers. It would be a family tearing itself apart. For a time, the two tribes were bound together under a single great leader, and his name was Kulayb ibn Rabia. Kulayb was a warrior and a chief of Taghlib, and by the tradition, he was magnificent. He united Bakr and Taghlib under his command and led them to a famous victory over their enemies, a triumph so complete that it made him the most powerful man in the region. He was, in effect, the king of the tribes. The victory that made his name was remembered for generations. He had genuinely earned his glory. The trouble was that he could not carry it lightly. But power did to Kulayb what it has done to many men. It went to his head. As his fame grew, so did his arrogance, until it curdled into something close to tyranny. He began to act as though the land itself belonged to him. He marked out great stretches of pasture as his own private protected ground, his hima, where no one could graze their animals without his leave. The stories say his pride swelled so far that he claimed even the wild game and the water as his to control, and that wherever his dog wandered, that ground too became forbidden to everyone else. He had made himself the law, and a man who makes himself the law in a world that runs on wounded pride is a spark looking for something to burn. That something arrived in the form of an old woman and her camel. Her name was al-Basus, and by the time she enters the story, she was an old woman staying as a guest among the tribe of Bakr, under the protection of a chief named Jassas ibn Murrah. This detail matters more than anything else in the story, so hold on to it. In this world, to take someone in as a guest, to grant them your protection, your jiwar, was one of the most sacred obligations a person could assume. A guest under your roof was untouchable, and to let harm come to them was to be disgraced before all the Arabs. Al-Basus was under Jassas's protection, and so was everything she owned. Among her animals, or by some accounts belonging to a neighbor she had taken under her own wing, was a she-camel. The tradition even remembers its name, Sarab. One day the camel wandered off, as camels do, and strayed onto the forbidden ground, the protected pasture of Kulayb. And Kulayb, the proud king of the tribes, who suffered no animal but his own upon his land, did exactly what his arrogance demanded. He took up his bow and shot the camel, striking it in the udder, so that, as the storytellers describe it, its milk ran down mingled with its blood into the sand. In that moment, Kulayb almost certainly thought nothing of it. It was his land. The animal had no business being there. The matter was closed. And that is the terrible smallness at the root of the whole war. The act that would eventually kill thousands felt, to the man who did it, like almost nothing at all. It was a small thing, a single animal in a vast desert. But it was not really about the animal at all, because what Kulayb had done was not simply to kill a camel. He had struck at something protected. He had violated the sacred bond of jiwar, the guarantee of safety that Jassas had extended over al-Basus and all that was hers. In the language of that world, it was a deliberate humiliation, and al-Basus knew exactly how to make that humiliation felt. She was, by the tradition, a woman who understood the power of words, and she raised her voice in bitter poetry, lamenting her helplessness and, above all, shaming her protectors. How could she feel safe among people who could not even protect her camel? What was a protection worth if it could be trampled by a tyrant's arrow? Her verses were not really grief. They were a weapon aimed straight at the honor of Jassas and his tribe. In the world of the tribes, this was a recognized and fearsome power. A woman's public lament could rouse men to war more surely than any chief's command, binding them, before the eyes of everyone, to avenge her or be shamed forever. This is how these feuds so often began, not with the injury itself, but with the unbearable shame of being seen to accept it. Jassas now stood exposed before his people. A guest under his protection had been wronged, and everyone was watching to see what he would do. To do nothing was to be branded a coward, and in that world, for a chief, that was a kind of death. The pressure of that shame would prove far more dangerous than any arrow. It was about to turn one dead camel into one dead king. Jassas made his choice. He would answer the insult with blood. He waited, and when the moment came, he fell upon Kulayb and ran him through with a spear. The mighty king of the tribes, the man who had claimed the very land and water as his own, lay dying in the open. The tradition lingers on his end. As he lay bleeding, Kulayb is said to have begged for a single mouthful of water and to have been refused, dying there in the dust, humbled at the last. The most powerful man in Arabia brought down over a camel. But the killing carried a second wound folded inside it, one that made everything to come even darker. Because Kulayb was no stranger to the man who killed him, Kulayb was married to Jalila, and Jalila was the sister of Jassas. With a single thrust of a spear, Jassas had killed his own sister's husband. He had not merely started a war between two tribes, he had torn open his own family. And on the other side of that family, a brother was about to learn that his king was dead. A brother who happened to be one of the most dangerous men in Arabia. Kulayb had a younger brother named Adi ibn Rabi'a, but history remembers him by another name, al-Muhalhil. In later legend, he would grow into a folk hero, known across the Arab world as al-Zir Salim. Before the killing, al-Muhalhil had been something of a carefree nobleman, a poet, fond of wine and music and pleasure, a man who seemed to take little in life very seriously. The death of his brother burned all of that away. By the tradition, he swore a terrible oath. He would touch no wine, no comfort, no woman until he had taken his revenge, until the blood of Kulayb had been repaid many times over. And he was as good as his word. He gathered the men of Taghlib around him, and he went to war. He began by striking down Jassas and another of the brothers who had shared in the killing. But this was never going to be a single act of revenge that closed the account. Al-Muhalhil did not want justice. He wanted vengeance without end. And so, instead of one death answering another, and the matter resting there, the two tribes, these cousins, these children of one ancestor, plunged into open war. It was, by our best reckoning, around the year 494. That war would not end for 40 years. Before we follow the armies, stay for a moment with one person, because she is the human heart of this whole tragedy. Jalila. Remember who she was. She was the wife of Kulayb, the murdered king, and she was the sister of Jassas, the man who murdered him. The two poles of the entire war, the killer and the killed, met in her, in one woman's broken heart. The tradition preserves her as a figure of almost unbearable grief, torn completely in two. If she mourned her husband, she was mourning a man killed by her own brother. If she defended her brother, she was defending the murder of her husband. There was no place in this she could stand that was not also a wound. Some accounts tell of her being blamed by her husband's people simply for being the killer's sister and driven away in her sorrow. Jalila is the reminder, standing at the very start of the war, of what these cycles of vengeance actually do. They are never clean. The line between us and them runs straight through families, through marriages, through the people we love most. And everyone caught on that line is torn by it. But honor, in that world, did not pause for a woman's grief. The war was already moving, and it was hungry. The Arabs did not remember this war as one long blur. They remembered it in pieces, as a series of famous battles they called the days. The day of al-Nahi, the day of al-Danaib, and many more. Each day was a set-piece clash, named, remembered, and retold for generations. These were not battles between standing armies. They were raids and ambushes. A camp struck at dawn, a caravan cut off, a well seized, a band of men caught in the open and killed. And riding among the warriors were the poets, composing verses that praised their own fallen and mocked the enemy's dead, so that every clash was fought twice, once with swords and once with words that kept the hatred fresh and ready for the next generation. In the early years, al-Muhalhil and his tribe of Taghlib had the upper hand. Burning with the fresh grief of Kulayb's death, they fell on Bakr again and again, and on days like al-Danaib, they dealt out terrible defeats, cutting down the men of Bakr in great numbers. For a time, it looked as though vengeance was being satisfied. But that is the trap of vengeance, and this war reveals it more clearly than almost any other story. Every blow demanded a counterblow. When Taghlib slaughtered the men of Bakr, the honor of Bakr now demanded that those deaths be answered in turn. So Bakr regrouped and struck back. And then Taghlib had fresh dead to avenge. And so it turned. Not a war with a goal that could be won, but a machine for turning each death into the reason for the next one. Years passed this way, then decades, and still it fed. And then came the single most famous moment of the entire war, built on an insult so casual and so cruel that it dragged even the peacemakers into the killing. There was a great chief of Bakr named al-Harith ibn Ubad, and for a long time he wanted nothing to do with this war. He was older and wiser perhaps, and he had held himself and his men apart, trying to keep the peace while the two tribes bled each other white. Then al-Muhalhil killed his son. The young man's name, in the tradition, was Bujair, and when al-Harith heard that his boy had been slain, he sent word to al-Muhalhil, seeking to understand, perhaps still hoping the death might be settled without more war. But al-Muhalhil's answer was pure contempt. He had killed Bujair, he said, as nothing more than a small down payment for the shoelace of Kulayb. In other words, your son's entire life is not worth even the strap of my dead brother's sandal. It is hard to imagine a more calculated insult, and it did exactly what such words do. It broke al-Harith. The peacemaker became the most terrible avenger of them all. He threw himself into the war, and at a great battle remembered as the Day of Wadidat, he led Bakr in a crushing blow against Taghlib. In the chaos of that day, the tradition says, al-Harith even seized al-Muhalhil himself without recognizing him, and, not knowing he held the author of all his grief, let him go. The man who had tried hardest to stop the war had been turned by a single sentence into its fiercest engine. That is how escalation works. It pulls in everyone, even the ones who know better. And still the war ground on. The day of Unayza, the day of al-Kusabat. Day after named day, year after year, the two tribes tore at each other across the deserts, until the original quarrel lay so far behind them that a child born at the start of the war could have died of old age before it ended. Watch what it did to the man who had set the vengeance in motion. Al-Muhalhil had entered the war a poet and a nobleman. By its later years, he was something else, a man hollowed out by grief and killing. His poetry turned almost entirely to elegy, to mourning the dead and the ruin of his own people. He had sworn to avenge his brother, and in doing so, he had helped destroy his own tribe. The revenge had consumed the avenger. And on both sides, exhaustion was setting in. The glory had long since drained out of it. There were fewer and fewer men left to fight, and more graves to tend. Somewhere in those endless years, people on both sides must have begun to ask the question no one had dared to ask at the start. What, exactly, are we still fighting for? A camel that had been dead for 30 years. They had almost forgotten how it began, but they could not find a way to make it stop. In the end, the War of Basus did not end in victory. No one won. It simply ran out of strength. After some 40 years, with both tribes shattered and bled white, outside hands finally pulled them apart. By the tradition, it fell to a powerful king of the tribe of Kinda to step in and impose a peace on the exhausted survivors, to stop at last the killing that the two tribes could not stop themselves. But notice how it ended. There was no grand settlement, no justice, no balancing of the accounts. The Arabs remembered a striking and bitter fact about this peace. that no proper reckoning was ever made for all that blood, that the countless dead were never truly paid for or reconciled. And so they gave the war a second haunting name. They called it al-Batra, which means roughly the severed war, or the incomplete one, the war that was simply cut off, unfinished, with nothing resolved. Think about what that means. 40 years of fighting, thousands of lives, two great tribes reduced to ruin. And at the end of it, the ledger did not balance. Nothing had been gained. Nothing had been settled. The blood had bought precisely nothing. The war had eaten a generation, and it had eaten the very reason for itself. And it left behind only the oldest lesson there is. For the Arabs who came after, the War of Basus became more than a story. It became a proverb, a permanent warning carved into their language. More ill-omened than the Basus, a catastrophe born of a trivial cause and a pride that would not bend. We should be honest that much of this story reaches us through poetry and legend, retold and reshaped across many centuries. The exact dates, the exact words, the exact order of the battles, we cannot always be sure of. But the shape of it, the terrible logic at its core, is as real and as true as anything in human history. Because strip away the desert and the camels and the ancient names, and the War of Basus is not really an old Arab story at all. It is a story about us, about how a small wrong, met with wounded pride instead of restraint, can grow into something no one can control. About how the demand to answer every insult, to avenge every wrong, can trap whole peoples in cycles that outlive the very reasons they began. We have watched this same machine run on far larger scales in our own time. Families, communities, and nations locked in feuds whose origins almost no one can still remember, each side unable to be the first to stop. And it always comes back to that camel, dead in a field at the very beginning. The war was never about the camel. The camel was only the excuse. And an excuse, in the hands of pride, is all it has ever taken to bury a generation.